We often think of southern towns as having a certain, well, familiar rhythm, don't we? But if you dig just a little deeper, sometimes you find histories that are surprisingly dramatic,
Yeah.
really transformative.
Mhm.
Take El Dorado, Arkansas. I mean, the name itself, El Dorado, it sort of hints at something special.
Mhm.
And its story, stretching from the early 1800s way into the mid-20th century, is just far more captivating than you might initially expect.
That's absolutely right. And that's really the mission for us today in this deep dive, to unpack the key forces that shaped El Dorado. We're looking at a really comprehensive historical account here, covering 1800 right up to 1955.
Yeah.
And the aim is to understand not just what happened, but, well, why it mattered.
Exactly. We've got this incredible sweep of history laid out in our sources, and for you, the learner, El Dorado's evolution, from a frontier settlement to this sudden oil boom town, it offers a really compelling way to look at broader American history. The story is just packed with unexpected turns and significant historical context, so let's get into it.
Let's do it. And I think a logical place to start is, well, the heart of El Dorado. Its town square and how the downtown developed. The changes just in that central area between, say, 1843 and 1955, they really mirror the town's shifting fortunes.
Okay, so Union County itself gets formed back in 1829. And initially, the key spots were river towns, right? Places like Ecor Fabra,
Yeah.
that's Camden now, and Champagnol. Makes sense, everyone relied on rivers for transport then.
Totally. Waterways were king.
But El Dorado itself doesn't pop up until 1843, so what actually sparked its creation?
Well, what's fascinating here is the role of this traveling merchant, a guy named Matthew Rainey. Apparently, he was just struck by how much demand there was for his goods in the area, so he decided, okay, I'm setting up a permanent store.
Just like that.
Pretty much. In 1843, he officially founded El Dorado. And the name, the Gilded One, that was actually suggested by County Commissioner John Hampton. Rainey even donated, get this, 160 acres for the town site, kept only 4 acres for himself.
Wow, that's quite a commitment. But okay, why move the county seat inland to this new spot? What was the logic there?
Yeah, good question. If you connect the dots, the main driver was agriculture, specifically cotton. The local residents really pushed to move the county seat up onto a ridge. It was the highest point around, mainly because it was closer to all the growing cotton plantations.
Oh,
And, importantly, less likely to flood compared to those river settlements. So that decision in 1843, it was really strategic. It lined up the administrative center with what was then the dominant economic force, cotton. And this kind of set a pattern for El Dorado, didn't it? Big shifts tied to resource economies.
so right away, the plan was
Yeah,
town square, courthouse. That shows some real foresight, planning for the future.
it really does. They earmarked $200 straight away for the courthouse, though interestingly, before they got that formal building up, this place called the Connor Cabin apparently served as an unofficial courthouse and post office starting around 1857. But yeah, that deliberate choice of a central, sort of defensible spot that really laid the groundwork for the town's layout and, its future growth.
And then the town just kind of grew organically out from that center point.
Well, not entirely spontaneous. A fellow named B. Frank Gordy formally platted the town in 1868, gave it some structure. Then it officially became a village in 1870 after a petition led by D.M. Bronson.
Okay.
And as the town grew later in the 19th century, that first courthouse just wasn't big enough. So they had to add on wings in 1875 and again in 1895. And around this time, you also start seeing residential areas developing, like the Murphy Hill Historic District just north of the main business area. Some houses there actually date back before 1900.
It's incredible trying to picture those early days. I wonder what those first town plans looked like. The account mentions the South Arkansas Historical Preservation Society might have some early maps. That'll be amazing to see.
Oh, absolutely. That'd give you a real feel for the beginnings. And then, as the 20th century kicked off, El Dorado's downtown started this major transformation. And it just went into overdrive with the oil boom in the 1920s.
Right.
The El Dorado Commercial Historic District, it got recognized in 2004. That really tells the story. It has 68 brick and masonry buildings from the early 20th century. But get this, 36 of them, that's like 76%, were built during that 1920s boom.
Wow.
So that shift from simpler buildings to much more elaborate styles, it's not just about looks. It's like a physical record of the new wealth and ambition oil brought. It's a visual story of the time changing.
So the architecture must have looked noticeably different then. What were the main changes you'd see?
Yeah, definitely. Before the boom, buildings were typically, simpler, one or two stories, maybe some basic corbelled brickwork. But then the oil money starts flowing, and suddenly you see much more ambitious styles. Classical Revival, Art Deco, and taller buildings start appearing. Things like the First Financial Bank and the Murphy Building really changed the skyline. Looking at old photos from the early 1900s would really show that difference.
And the Union County Courthouse itself, that wasn't just one building either, was it? It evolved over time.
Exactly. That original 19th century courthouse, even with the additions, it was eventually replaced in 1909. And interestingly, part of the money for that one came from something called the Kaffir Corn Carnival.
A corn carnival funded the courthouse.
Apparently so. Kind of
Yeah.
highlights the community involvement. Right. But even that wasn't the end of it. The really grand classical revival limestone courthouse you see today, that was built between 1927 and 1928, a real symbol of that oil boom prosperity. And we should probably mention the Confederate monument on the courthouse lawn, too. That was added to the National Register in 1996. Comparing photos of the different courthouses would definitely show the town's progress.
For sure. Now, the historical account mentions Sanborn fire insurance maps quite a bit. Why are they so important for understanding how El Dorado developed?
Oh, these maps are just gold mines for historians.
Mm,
They were originally made to assess fire risk, right? So they give you this incredibly detailed, like, building by building picture of the town at specific moments.
right.
So the map from June 1924, which catches El Dorado just as the oil boom is really taking off, that would show you things like density, what kinds of businesses were there, including the first oil-related ones, public buildings, how the commercial and residential areas met. The South Arkansas Historical Preservation Society apparently has a copy of that one.
And if you compare that 1924 map to later ones, you'd really see the boom's impact physically.
Exactly. Later maps, like the 1929 one, which was updated and republished in 1953, you can find that one at the Library of Congress. They'd show all the infill development, the taller buildings popping up, specialized businesses catering just to the oil industry where the oil company offices were located, how the commercial areas pushed outwards. It's like a visual timeline of just how dramatically oil changed the town.
The account even mentions a table, Table 1, I think, summarizing those key changes between the 24 and 53 maps. Things like building density, new business types, oil infrastructure, commercial expansion, really drives home the scale of it all.
It really does. And if you think about the economy before oil hit, it was mainly, as we said, agriculture, cotton especially, and timber. Matthew Rainey's store was obviously key early on. And the Felsenthal family were big players, land, timber. They ran the Carson dry goods store until 1921. Then, bang, their focus shifts to oil.
Huh.
And Ike Felsenthal, one of the brothers, he was also really active civically, helps get the Chamber of Commerce going.
Then the oil boom hits, and it sounds like it just completely flipped the script on the business scene. No, completely. You had this massive wave of entrepreneurs pouring in. The economy became much more diversified almost overnight. And one really notable thing was the emergence of a significant Jewish business community. You had families like the Baums and Jewelry, the Ginsbergs with Arkansas Pipe and Supply, the Pesses involved in steel and paper bags, the Burks doing jewelry and optometry, Morris Lewis with his New York store, the Grunfest brothers starting Sterling stores.
Wow, quite a list.
Yeah, and by 1923, you had something like 59 oil contracting companies operating just in El Dorado, plus refiners, distributors, production companies. It was a totally new economic world. Old city directories from that time would be fascinating, just listing all these new businesses.
Okay, so downtown El Dorado gets physically reshaped by oil money. But what was the actual discovery? The one that lit the fuse? Right, this is where the story gets really dramatic. Now, there'd been some natural gas found in 1920 and a little bit of oil over in Wachita County, but nothing major. The real catalyst was the B.Z. Armstrong #1 well.
Okay.
It was drilled by a local doctor, Samuel T. Boozy, who kind of dabbled in oil speculation. And on January 10th, 1921, down at about 2,233 feet, they hit the Nackatuck Sand Formation just southwest of town, and it was big.
A real gusher, the kind you see in movies.
Pretty much. Initial estimates were wild, like 15 to 35 million cubic feet of gas and maybe 3,000 to 10,000 barrels of oil and water mix per day. Apparently, you could see the derrick from town, and there was this oil mist settling everywhere.
Incredible.
Now, the Busey well itself only produced for about 45 days, but that didn't matter. It was the spark. It ignited the El Dorado oil boom. Photos from that time showing that first well, and then just this forest of derricks popping up everywhere. They really capture the frenzy.
The sudden flood of people must have just overwhelmed the town, didn't it?
Oh, completely unprecedented. The population went from under 4,000 in the 1920 census to, well, estimates say maybe 25,000, even 30,000 within just a couple of years.
No way.
Yeah. The infrastructure just collapsed under the strain. You had 22 trains arriving daily. Housing, forget about it. People were living in tents, makeshift shacks, reportedly paying just to sleep on someone's porch.
Wow.
It created this really chaotic, almost Wild West atmosphere. Full of opportunity, sure, but also massive social strain. They tried throwing up social amenities quickly, like an amusement park built in a hurry, a cotton shed turned into an auditorium. But crime also soared, which led to vigilante groups forming, and even some nasty violence like the Battle of the Ouachita.
That sounds incredibly disruptive. The population growth table mentioned in the account, table 2, I think, it really shows that jump between 1920 and 1930. It's stark.
It really is. And behind all this chaos were some key people, obviously Dr. Basie. But then you had figures like H.L. Hunt, who apparently showed up almost broke and became a major independent producer there before hitting it even bigger in Texas.
The H.L. Hunt.
The very same. Started out making deals in the Garrett Hotel lobby. Charles Daniels, who supervised the drilling on BZ number 1, he put his own money in, and even local folks like Wang Hing, who owned a laundry, and Ike Filsenthal, the merchant we mentioned, they all took a gamble on that first well.
The account also mentions Sidney Umstead and a discovery over in Smackover. How did that fit in?
Yeah, that was huge, too. Just over a year later, July 1922, Sidney Umstead drilled the discovery well in Smackover, and that turned out to be another massive oil field. It just solidified the whole region's importance in the oil game and definitely impacted El Dorado as well. You know, Table 3 in the account lists some of these key figures, and their roles helps put faces to this explosive period.
So that initial, almost frenzied boom, it eventually had to settle down into something more organized, more corporate.
Exactly. If it was going to last, it needed structure. And that's where companies like Lion Oil really stepped up. Colonel Thomas H. Barton became the key figure there. He arrived early, in Jan 21, involved with natural gas initially. But then in 1929, he took over the struggling Lion Oil refining company and just transformed it.
That's right.
Built it into a major integrated company, thousands of employees, service stations everywhere. They bought up a lot of acreage in Smackover, found more oil in the Schuler field in 37. By 1955, Lion Oil actually merged with Monsanto. Huge success story.
And Murphy Oil, that also started right there in El Dorado during the boom.
Deeply connected. The Murphy family was already established, banking, timber. Charles H. Murphy Sr., he'd had the strategy of buying up scattered land, kind of anticipating oil might be found. Smart move.
Definitely paid off.
Big time. They ended up with significant royalty interests in the Smackover field. His son, Charles H. Murphy Jr., took the reins in 1941, consolidated things into C.H. Murphy and Company in 46, which then became Murphy Corporation in 1950. That laid the foundation for the Murphy Oil we know today. And having these big headquarters, Lion and Murphy, stay in El Dorado was crucial for the town's long-term economic health.
It wasn't just the giants, though, right? The boom must have sparked tons of smaller related businesses, too.
Oh, absolutely. By 1923, like we mentioned, dozens of drilling contractors, distributors, refiners like the El Dorado Oil Refinery, producers, the whole ecosystem just exploded. The economic impact was massive, and it lasted. I mean, the El Dorado field was a national leader in production for a while.
Yeah.
And Union County had the highest per capita income in Arkansas for a lot of the 20th century, mainly because of oil. Now, there were downsides. Of course, early pollution was definitely an issue. And it's a cyclical industry, right? Things tanked in the Depression, then recovered. World War II brought some diversification with chemical and munitions plants. But El Dorado's ability to keep those corporate HQs, Lion and Murphy, really helped it weather the storms. And culturally, you still see that legacy today. The Arkansas Museum of Natural Resources up in Smackover, El Dorado's own oil heritage park downtown.
So oil completely reshaped the economy, the look of the town. What about the people living there? What was the cultural impact of all that sudden change?
Yeah, that's such a critical part of the El Dorado story. And the town's racial history is just deeply tangled up with its economic and social path. You know, back in the antebellum days, the economy ran on enslaved labor for cotton. By 1860, Union County's population was actually majority enslaved.
Wow, majority enslaved. That's stark.
It really is. And that deep segregation we see later in things like the education system, it just highlights those systemic inequalities. Even a booming economy didn't lift all boats equally.
How did things look after the Civil War moving into the later 19th century?
Well, demographics shifted some. You had more black settlers coming in during the 1870s, but sadly, it was also a time of really high racial tension and violence. The account mentions lynchings, these awful southern Arkansas race riots in the late 1890s, terrible incidents near El Dorado, often white workers targeting black laborers, and then there was the horrific burning of a black World War I veteran near El Dorado in 1919.
It's just a brutal reminder of the prejudice back then. But despite all that hostility, the African-American community still managed to build lives and communities, didn't they?
Absolutely. Incredible resilience. By the 1930s and 40s, there was a substantial African-American population, maybe around 4,000 people. They established distinct neighborhoods, places like Fairview, Douglas Edition, St. Louis Edition, Rock Island Quarters.
But opportunities were limited, especially in the oil fields.
Very limited, yeah. Mostly domestic service or just general labor. The economic stratification was pretty clear, even with all the oil money sloshing around.
The account mentions Pernella Anderson and her work with the Federal Writers Project. That sounds really important.
Hugely important. She was one of only 2 black interviewers for the FWP in the whole state. Between 1936 and 39, she recorded interviews with former slaves, collected folklore from black residents right there in El Dorado. Her work gives us this incredibly precious window into their lives, their culture, their experiences during that time.
That's amazing that it was captured.
It really is. And later on, you have the Niall and Marzell Smith Museum of African American History established, named after educators from Washington High, the black high school. It helps keep that legacy alive. You know, those neighborhoods born out of segregation, they also became centers of community life, strong social networks, cultural continuity. You see the vibrancy in Anderson's folklore collection.
What about the broader culture and social life in El Dorado beyond that specific community experience?
Well, early on, churches were central. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians all established congregations in the 19th century. But there was also some serious social drama before the oil boom. Most notably, this thing called the Tucker-Parnell feud from about 1902 to 1905.
A feud,
Yep.
like Hatfields and McCoy style.
Pretty intense, yeah.
Yeah.
Apparently started over some dispute involving the town marshal, Guy Tucker, and the Parnell family. Led to maybe 30, 40 deaths, shootouts right on the courthouse square. Even the state militia had to come in. It really divided the community deeply, and the account says some people even left the area because of it. Shows there were some underlying tensions even before oil shook everything up.
And the boom hits. That must have just transformed the social scene.
Oh, yeah. All those new people, all that new money, massive demand for entertainment. They said El Dorado had theaters on nearly every corner. The Rialta Theater, finished in '29, was the crown jewel. Cost $250,000, fancy architecture, seated 1,400 people, had the latest sound technology.
Impressive.
Definitely. But, you know, reflecting the times, it had segregated entrances and seating for African Americans way in the back. Still, it shows the demand for culture and entertainment was way up. And later, you get more formal institutions. The South Arkansas Symphony starts in '56, the Arts Center in '64, suggests things were maturing culturally. And the oil boom also spurred growth in El Dorado's Jewish community, building on families like the Felsenthals who were already there. They even established a benign B'rith Lodge in 1922.
Education is always such a key piece of the puzzle for understanding a community. What were the early school efforts like in El Dorado?
Well, organized schooling in the county actually started even before El Dorado was founded. But in El Dorado, the first private academy popped up right in 1843, run by Reverend William Lacey and his wife Julia out of their home.
Wow, started small.
Yeah. It later became the El Dorado Female Institute, led by Elizabeth Banks, on land donated by Albert Rust. He was the first congressman from Union County. So pretty early on, there was this commitment to education, including for women, which is notable. That site eventually became part of South Arkansas Community College.
And then the public school system, how did that take shape?
Well, mirroring society at the time, it was strictly segregated. For white students, you had El Dorado High School, built in 1905. And for a while, from 1928 to '42, the school district also ran El Dorado Junior College.
The junior college run by the school district.
Yeah, it was meant to prepare students for university, shared buildings and teachers with the high school. Apparently, it had a pretty solid curriculum for the time and was the biggest non-endowed municipal junior college in the state before it closed during World War II due to low enrollment.
Okay, so what about education for African American students?
There was a school for black children by 1897. And Washington High School was formally set up in 1908. That became the main high school for generations of black students in the area. They even had yearbooks, the Bulletin, the Hornet. Imagine the stories in those.
For sure.
In 1949, Washington High got a new building, and the old one became Carver Grammar School for Black elementary kids. The Niall and Marzell Smith Museum, as we mentioned, really honors the legacy of Washington High.
It's just so striking how separate everything was. What was the situation with desegregation leading up to 1955, the end of our period here?
Yeah, segregation was absolute reality through this whole period, 1800 to 1955. Washington High and Carver for black students, El Dorado High, and the junior college for white students. That was Jim Crow law. Higher education access for black Arkansans was incredibly limited. No black undergraduates at state colleges before 1955, just a very few admitted to grad programs at UA, like law or medicine.
So basically no path to a state university degree for black students.
Not an undergraduate one, no. There was this tiny, tentative step in the summer of '55. Two black teachers from a nearby town attended a UA graduate extension course held at Southern State College in Magnolia. So they were officially UA students, but it was an extension course off the main campus.
Right.
A few state colleges started minimal desegregation in the fall of '55, but El Dorado schools were not among them by that point. This whole structure just baked in inequality, unequal facilities, unequal resources. It had long-term consequences. And the fact that even limited graduate education came so late for black educators just shows how deeply entrenched segregation was and how slow change was before Brown v. Board really started to have an impact after 1954.
Yeah, the buildings themselves, the architecture, they often tell their own quiet story. What does El Dorado's architecture tell us about its history?
Oh, absolutely. Take the John Newton House. It dates back to around 1849, making it the oldest building still standing in El Dorado. It's a great example of antebellum Greek revival style.
Greek revival, okay.
Yeah, simplified columns, side porch. It's a museum now, run by the South Arkansas Historical Preservation Society. It was originally on Peach Street. The Newtons were early settlers, and the thinking is they probably built it as a townhouse so their kids could go to school in El Dorado, even though their plantation was outside town. Kind of reinforces El Dorado's early role as an educational and civic hub. Finding any old pictures of it on Peach Street would be fantastic for understanding its original setting.
And the town also has these distinct historic residential areas, right? Each telling a slightly different story.
Exactly. You've got neighborhoods that reflect different waves of growth. The Murphy Hill Residential Historic District, just north of downtown, developed mostly between the 1880s and the 1950s. But a big chunk of its buildings, almost half, went up during the oil boom years, the 20s and 30s.
So denser development then.
Yeah, denser than the earlier late 19th century part. And you see a real mix of styles there. Queen Anne, different revival styles. Lots of craftsman bungalows. It includes the Newton House, the big Charles H. Murphy Senior House, and even the El Dorado apartments. Then there's the Monty Residential Historic District, also north of downtown. That one's even more a product of the 1920s boom. Almost 3/4 of the construction happened then, with more growth in the 40s and 50s. Feels more like an early 20th century working class area that expanded north after the oil hit. Styles there are more like colonial revival, craftsman, minimal traditional, even some early ranch houses. The account has a table 5, I think, that breaks down the main architectural styles, their features, and where you see them. It's pretty helpful.
Beyond those districts, any specific houses that really stand out historically or architecturally?
Well, besides the Newton House, yeah, especially homes tied to those big oil families. The Charles H. Murphy Senior House in Murphy Hill, built in the mid-20s, is this big Tudor revival mansion. Really shows off the wealth oil generated.
A statement piece.
Definitely. And the El Dorado apartments, also in Murphy Hill, they're interesting because they show the town diversifying its housing. Needed places for all those new people moving in, right? So you see this evolution from the simpler Greek revival of the Newton House, reflecting that earlier agricultural wealth, to the elaborate revivals of the oil barons like Murphy, and then multi-unit housing for a growing urban population. It's like reading the town's economic and social history right there in the buildings.
A town needs more than just buildings, though. It needs connections, infrastructure, and the industries that support it all. What about those background elements in El Dorado?
Absolutely crucial. Railroads, for instance. Their arrival in the late 19th century was a massive turning point. Took El Dorado from being pretty isolated to having real commercial reach. The first passenger train pulled in from Camden back in 1891. That north-south line quickly became the main artery, much more important than the rivers.
And vital for resources, I assume.
Totally. Especially timber. The railroads were key to getting into those vast forests and hauling out the lumber. That spurred the whole lumber industry. You also had smaller, short-line railroads pop up, like the El Dorado and Wesson Railway, initially built just to serve a lumber mill. Later, it even carried petroleum and chemicals. Another one, the El Dorado and Bastrop Railway, helped develop communities south of town and was important for shipping cotton and lumber. The account has a table, Table 6, laying out this railroad timeline and impact. They were sequential enablers, really. First timber, then supporting agriculture, and then absolutely essential for the oil boom. Remember those 22 trains a day, needed for workers, equipment, everything.
Right, the railroads kind of paved the way. What about the timber industry itself? How big a deal was that before oil?
Oh, it was huge. Alongside cotton, it was the main economic engine before oil. Massive virgin pine forests, and the railroads made it possible to exploit them on a large scale. You had big players like J.S. Cargyle, who had a sawmill and even a company town, and the Union Sawmill Company in Huttig that was the largest in the county. Even Charles H. Murphy Sr. started out with timber interests.
So timber built other towns nearby, too.
Yeah, places like Cullion, Felsenthal, Strong grew because of timber. Now, early on, the approach was often just cut out and get out. But by the 1920s, some bigger companies like Union Sawmill were actually starting to think about sustained yield forestry, more long-term management. Seeing photos of those old sawmills and logging camps would be really something.
And before timber really took off, cotton was king, right?
Absolutely. Cotton was the foundation. It's why they moved the county seat inland in the first place, closer to the cotton farms, away from the river floods. And unfortunately, you can't talk about cotton in the antebellum South without talking about slavery. Union County relied heavily on enslaved African Americans, who were the majority by 1860. You would have had cotton gins all over, processing the harvest, located near transport rivers, then railroads. El Dorado, being a rail hub and center for the cotton region, surely had them. Towns like Strong became key cotton shipping points thanks to the railroad. So cotton started it all, then timber and railroads built on that, and then oil just exploded onto the scene. But cotton farming didn't disappear, it just became part of a more layered economy.
It's so clear that specific people, specific families, really drove these changes. Who were some of the key individuals shaping El Dorado across this whole period?
Well, you've got the founders and early leaders, right? Matthew Rainey, who started it all, John and Penelope Newton building that oldest house, Albert Russ, the congressman who donated land for the girls' school, Reverend Lacey starting the first church and academy, later B. Frank Gordy platting the town, D.M. Bronson pushing for incorporation, J.S. Cargyle with the early sawmill and railroad. These guys laid the groundwork.
And then the families who built the big industries.
Yeah, absolutely pivotal. The Murphy family, Charles Sr., moving there in 1904, involved in banking, timber, then hitting it big with oil land and royalties, built that impressive Tudor house. Then his son, Charles Jr., taking over, consolidating, building Murphy Oil, and they became major philanthropists later with things like the El Dorado Promise.
Right.
Colonel Thomas Harry Barton, he shows up right as the boom starts, builds Lion Oil into this massive company, and also becomes a major philanthropist. Hospitals, libraries, the Barton Coliseum in Little Rock. And the Felsenthal family, early Jewish settlers, active in timber and dry goods. Then Ike and Sidney successfully pivot into oil. Ike was a real civic booster, too, with the Chamber of Commerce.
The account also mentions people significant in, well, less positive ways, like the feud, and also key figures in social history and healthcare.
True. The Tucker and Parnell families, central figures in that violent feud back in the early 1900s that really shows the raw, sometimes dangerous, social dynamics of the time. Then you have Pernella Anderson, whose work documenting the African-American experience through the FWP is just invaluable for understanding the crucial part of El Dorado's story. And in healthcare, Dr. Fred Preston starting the first hospital and Frank Allen's huge donation for the Susan B. Allen Memorial Hospital later on. These stories all woven together, the industrialists, the civic leaders, the chroniclers of overlooked histories, even the figures involved in conflict. They show the complex mix of ambition, power, community building, and sometimes violence that shaped El Dorado.
So if we try to pull it all together, looking back over this whole sweep, 1800 to 1955, what's the big picture narrative of El Dorado's journey? What are the main takeaways?
I think the overarching story is one of really profound transformation, driven primarily by natural resources. It starts as this agricultural center, cotton, then timber, then boom, 1921 hits, oil is discovered, and it becomes Arkansas's original boomtown. Everything changes.
You can really see distinct phases.
Definitely. Phase 1, founding and early growth, 19th century. Planned town, farming core, railroads enabling timber. Phase 2, the oil boom and its immediate aftermath, say 1921 through the 30s. Population explosion, economy totally restructured, huge physical changes, new architecture downtown, oil fortunes made. Phase 3, maturation and diversification, maybe 1930s to 55. Riding out the Depression, recovery, big companies like Lion and Murphy consolidating, adding chemical manufacturing during WWII.
And by 1955, what are the lasting legacies?
You've got a solid industrial economy based on oil and chemicals, with major corporate headquarters. A unique urban landscape, that historic downtown, the residential areas showing different eras, especially the 1920s boom, the big courthouse. Evolving social and cultural life, though still deeply segregated in 55. A really complex social mix and the legacy of slavery and racial conflict, but also resilient communities and diverse entrepreneurial groups. And that critical railroad infrastructure adapted over time for different needs. El Dorado is just a fascinating case study, isn't it? Shows the radical impact resource discovery can have. It transformed everything: economy, society, the very look of the place. The 1955 town was a product of all those layers. Frontier farming, timber town, but ultimately defined by oil.
So El Dorado's story is just this remarkable example of how a place gets fundamentally reshaped layer upon layer by land, by timber, and then overwhelmingly by oil. And by the human stories wrapped up in all that change. It's definitely packed with those surprising facts, those aha moments that make history really grab you.
Exactly. And for you, the learner, digging into El Dorado's past like this, it really offers insights into those bigger themes, doesn't it? Resource economies, the shock waves of rapid social change, and just how communities manage to adapt, rebuild, and endure through it all.
It really does make you wonder, what parallels can you see between what happened in El Dorado and other boomtowns, or even communities today facing huge, rapid transformations? And maybe how does that legacy of resource extraction, for better or worse, continue to shape places like El Dorado long after the initial boom fades? Definitely some fascinating things to think about.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the rich and complex history of El Dorado, Arkansas.